Might get started. Looks like good. Most of us in here. Cool. Thank you very much, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the final panel of the day for this first day of BN 2022. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here to be chairing and starting off this final panel on political paths to a UBI, building power to dissolve power. We've got a wonderful panel of speakers today. Waka Waka and Woolly Woolly woman advocate, academic, Dr. Tjanara Goreng, Deputy Director of Anglicare Australia, Maiy Azize, Executive Director of the United Workers Union, Godfrey, Moase, and New South Wales Greens MLC, Abigail Boyd. 3 on Zoom, 2 of us in the room, and all brilliant thinkers and activists. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. I'm Tim Hollo, the Executive Director of the Green Institute, and I'll start by acknowledging that we're holding this conversation on stolen land and paying my respects on behalf of all of us to elders past, present, and those still to come. It's been my privilege in recent years to learn from Aboriginal elders and leaders, including Tjanara, among others, about the philosophies and worldviews that underpin Indigenous philosophies and practices and politics. They're worldviews that now infuse a lot of my thinking, that flow through my new book, Living Democracy, and that flow through the philosophical approach that I bring to opening this session today. At the core is the idea that country owns us, not the other way around, that we and everything we do and make are part of the natural world and inextricably, entirely intertwined with it. This underpins a system of governance and economy that's based on relationality and reciprocity. And our capitalist, extractivist economy, of course, replaces and inverts that with the belief that everything is subject to ownership. The soil under our feet, the air we breathe, the plants and animals we share the land with, and we ourselves, our time, our bodies, our emotions, become resources to be bought, sold, and stolen, and from which to extract value. It's a system that's obviously far from relationality and reciprocity, and turns into one of domination and coercion. And it's this philosophy of domination and coercion that sits behind all of the crises that are implied by the theme of this conference, whether it's the rise of authoritarianism, the destruction of the natural world, or coercive employment systems which force people to put themselves in harm's way during a pandemic. Extractivist economies, of course, need a supply of cheap and obedient labour, and our governing and economic systems ensure this supply by commodifying all basic needs and keeping us too busy and exhausted to self-provision and organise, by undermining the ability of workers to collectively bargain, by instilling and enforcing a culture of work and labourism, and of course by simply making unemployment intolerable. From workfare programs to humiliating drug testing, paternalistic parenting courses, constant surveillance, the system is deliberately coercive. It's an approach that's designed not just to punish the currently unemployed, but to use their suffering as a warning to others. By reducing the value of human life to what we can sell our labour for, by entangling our capacity to survive with our capacity to sell our labour, extractivism is turned on us. In my view, a universal basic income could structurally end the extractivist nature of labour by disentangling work from the capacity to survive. It could recast the relationship between citizen and government. Instead of the Leviathan state surveilling, judging, and punishing you, putting conditions on your right to survive, government could become an enabler for every citizen to choose their own path. It's fundamentally, in this view, about dissolving power, about distributing power. If we accept this analysis, here's the challenge that this afternoon's session is about. Power won't dissolve itself. We need to dissolve it. Any political strategy towards implementing a basic income of any kind must work to build political power, build power to dissolve power. So this isn't simply about proving the policy or showing public support. We've done that very successfully. And yet, having done that, major political actors, major political parties, unions, and other civil society organisations are largely either uninterested or still actively opposed. Here's the thing, in my view. If a universal basic income dramatically reduces the coercive power of the state and capital, it also poses a real challenge to the power of those who've aligned themselves with the power of state and capital, or who've been co-opted by it. Present company, of course, excluded, which is why I invited this group of people. Much of the union movement, many social service organisations, and almost all of mainstream politics fits that description. The major parties are, of course, deeply entangled with corporate power and have very little or no interest in disentangling that. Particularly since the Accords here, but predating that as well, Australia's union movement, by and large, has endorsed the use of state power to coerce labour. Many loud and influential voices in Indigenous politics support punitive policies to enforce participation in existing economic and political systems. And many social service organisations are largely comfortable with their role in advocating for tweaks to a system which they participate in. Indeed, it's my perception that many civil society organisations are genuinely worried about the idea of giving deeper agency and power to their constituents. Threading this needle must be done with great care, and we're going to hear how a few leaders in this field are working to do so this afternoon. But in closing my opening, I want to briefly outline the model of transformational change that I set out in my book, Living Democracy. It's a model based on reorganisation through collapse. And I suggest that systems of coercive power all around the world are actually in crisis at the moment. People are losing faith in existing systems and working to build new ones. At the same time, of course, power holders are grasping ever tighter to those forms of coercion. So we face a choice, in a sense, between deeper domination or deeper democracy. In order to hold off the rise of authoritarianism, as Scott Santons mentioned this morning as well, we need to dissolve systems of coercion, and the power that we build must be a new form of power then. It must be one that doesn't play to or buttress existing forms of coercive power, but cultivates distributed, dispersed grassroots power. We could, for instance, imagine a basic income that's implemented in such a way through coercive power that it actually continues to atomise and alienate us. And I'm sure many of us have had conversations to that effect. We must not do it that way. My model of change draws together the ecological model of transformational change known as panarchy with Gramsci's understanding of hegemony as a combination of institutional and cultural power, both of which are models of transformation through collapse, and proposes through that a four-step process towards transformation. It starts with seeding alternative ways of being. It builds constituencies around them, creating demand and enabling others to replicate them. It withdraws consent from the old ways of being and demonstrating that we can do things better ourselves. And it begins to build new institutions around the new alternatives to replace old institutions in crisis. Could we, through our communities, our organisations and our constituencies, implement universal payments directly in our own communities, perhaps using local currencies sometimes, mobilising the power that we share to share resources? Not imagining them as trials or pilots, but seeing them as simply beginning the work ourselves to reconstruct how we live. Could we simply live into being new economic and political institutions that are truly about enabling everyone to live instead of coercing everyone to work? I believe we could, and I hope to discuss that this afternoon and over the next couple of days. And now we'll move to the rest of the panel. I want to introduce first Dr. Tjanara Goreng to speak to us for a bit. You there, Tjanara? Hello.
Hello, yes, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to acknowledge the ancestors of our country, Namjanatia, now called Australia, and welcome everyone from all the countries that they've come to from around the world and honour their First Nations people, as well as our own here in Australia. So I'm going to talk about this topic from the point of view of First Nations people. In Australia, First Nations people have had no political power until the land rights movement gained momentum in the 1970s. But even then, the lack of a treaty or makarata or an agreement with the First Nations people in our own country has marred relationships since invasion. The 200 years of continuous exploitation of lands, lives, the removal of children, the operation of terra nullius, and the attempted genocide during the frontier wars and continued through various policies have meant that the British government and now the Australian government, who colonised Australia, have showed no intention of giving First Nations people here any rights, self-determination or recognition of their sovereignty. There is no free, prior nor informed consent as to what occurs on our lands nor to our lives. We are the fodder often for social policies of governments of every kind. In Australia, our governments have practiced social policy on our First Nations communities first to see if it will work in the broader mainstream. There are many examples of that, especially in the income support policy arena. For example, the Northern Territory intervention, the use of cashless welfare debit cards and the basic cards. Often political, civil, social, cultural and the economic rights of First Nations people are of no consideration to policy, and lip service is always often given to First Nations policy. As we have no political power, we must create it, influence it, partner with it, and sustain it through relationships with those who have like ideas and with people who have the realisation the colonisation of Australia and the subsequent failures in policy have only produced poverty of all kinds amongst our communities. We must align ourselves with those who have power, but also share our values and those who recognise that injustices have occurred and continue still to this day. Thus, building political relationships where we can influence the uptake of a UBI is, I consider, a paramount opportunity now here in Australia, where society is ever more realising that First Nations people have been dealt the worst blows to their human rights. Their self-determination has been usurped politically, and the lack of recognition of sovereignty and the striking of a treaty is still many years away. So how do we build political powers as a community? The experience I've had is to build a relational network with various forms of people who think and value the same things, but particularly in politics, to align oneself with a political party that has similar values and that supports a UBI in principle, to then utilise that platform and that power that they have in government to implement new legislation, to influence and affect change, and to inform others that implementing a UBI in Australia, beginning with First Nations people, as we are often the experiment, so this could be a first step to examining its application at a wider level. We have survived in our own country for thousands of years, and we will continue to do so because we know how to align ourselves with the political, economic, cultural and social interests that share our common goals. In First Nations communities in Australia, welfare reform through income support policy is based on levers used to create behavioural change. The architect of this method of policy was the Prime Minister, John Howard, of the Liberal Conservative National Party coalition, in association with Noel Pearson, one of our so-called Aboriginal leaders. Being a Conservative, Noel saw addiction and abuse and violence as destructive forces in remote communities, and he aligned himself with the Howard government to recommend to Cabinet that he be able to set up a family commission in 4 communities to pilot a welfare reform system that gave people money if they did certain things, such as to feed their children, to send them to school, and then the system punished them and took their limited Centrelink money off them if they did not do these things. I'm giving you this as an example. So adjudicated by a group of community members, this system was a godsend for white people who had been tearing their hair out about what to do with the drinking, gambling and what they considered antisocial behaviours in these remote communities. And they could say it was self-determined because it was sanctioned and thought up by leaders such as Noel. What this meant was that other jurisdictions in Australia thought that this was great. We could replicate this. The program was first implemented in Northern Queensland, with the state and federal governments entering into an agreement with Pearson's Community Corporation to establish and run it. Many people railed against it, including Aboriginal people in those communities, and it has never been properly evaluated, despite an expenditure of upward of $45 million on it. Some years later, Howard used the supposed levels of sexual abuse of children in remote Northern Territory communities to rescind the anti-discrimination legislation and implement a system of welfare control that catapulted most Aboriginal adults in the Northern Territory into 15 years of degrading poverty. The system brought in welfare and income control using the basics card to buy essentials and to restrict using government income on gambling and drinking, etc., to supposedly reduce levels of violence and addiction and abuse of children and women, even though there were no statistics really to prove that this was occurring. Eventually, over the past 15 years, various governments have introduced the system into other communities around Australia in the mainstream amongst non-Indigenous peoples, and this is currently expected to finish soon under the current government. Just about every social policy relating to First Nations people in Australia since 1788 has excluded our self-determination, diminished our capacity to develop out of poverty, and forced us to concede to governments who don't care and often just want the issues and the problems to go away. We've always been spoken about in deficit discourse language, despite our high resilience and our capacity to survive near extinction through deliberate policies of genocide, decades of slavery work for no wages, or having our wages stolen to prop up white health systems. Being a minority population requires us to seek support of the majority, or at least a powerful part of it. The UBI would enable any First Nations adult to survive above the poverty line on a guaranteed income that could give them the necessities of life to live with dignity in our society, where they are mostly still considered third-class citizens. A UBI is a common goal for humanity to lift people who live in poverty with no capacity to achieve their goals politically or socially themselves through having a lack of capacity and deliberate government policy that continues to oppress them. The UBI can do this, and so I advocate aligning ourselves with those people in our parliaments with legislative power to implement a workable UBI to do so, and begin that with our communities, as I believe it can work to our common good. In recent years, we have seen a surge of significance in Australia where First Nations art, culture, sport, filmmaking, business and entrepreneurs have infiltrated so much of Australian society that there is a much deeper recognition of First Nations communities, people and culture, and the benefits we bring to Australia and international society. Most major companies have implemented changes in employment and other business practices to support First Nations businesses in their fields to develop. We are much more visible than we have ever been, but we still have no political power. Even those First Nations people who have been elected to our governments in various parties or as independents do not have positions where they can effect deep legislative change. The Uluru Statement of the Heart was produced over 2 years ago, and the government is now investing in constitutional change to recognise First Nations people in the Australian Constitution so that we might have a voice and a say in what occurs in legislation in our federal parliament. For some reason, when reading the Uluru Statement, which prefaces and expresses the need for sovereignty as its main focus, through a Makarrata agreement to undertake a treaty, establish truth-telling and constitute a voice, somebody decided that a constitutional recognised voice is what we should do, completely disregarding the express wish to create a sovereign relationship between two sovereign groups in Australia. This would bring about political power for us. This was the aspirational nature of the statement, not a referendum to change the Constitution, and yet this is what we have. So always the voices of self-determination and sovereignty are silenced for some. We can only have power in Australia through our sovereignty. In having our sovereignty recognised, we can negotiate how we are part of the governance of Australia, not how the majority dominant cultural group decides how we have power. In doing so, we can then have the power to reduce the constant bickering and fighting over what wins in Parliament and create a system of collaboration and unity in decision-making that is based in the one thing that we can all agree on for the good of people who live in Australia, for all Australians and for Australia. Then we build consensus for what we agree on and take out the fighting, the manipulation, the destruction of people's lives through policies which don't support them, the country, or peace and harmony. First Nations governance is about quiet unity and deep consensus based on listening to the land, listening to the people, listening to the animals and to the earth, and making decisions based on action now for future generations by wise people, wise elders, who have deep lived experience and knowledge of how to do it. Then power becomes invisible in our communities because it is accepted and trusted by all. This is my recommendation in terms of building power for the use of the UBI. Thank you so much for listening. Ua Palya.
Thank you so much, Tjanara. Wonderful. I hope you can hear the applause in the room. Hand over now to Maiy Azize. Maiy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you so much to the Congress for having me here and for accommodating those of us who weren't able to join in person. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining from the lands of the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the Narragansett and Ngambri people who traded on, travelled through and connected with this land. So as some of you at the Congress may know, last year Anglicare Australia became the first major charity or NGO in Australia to back a basic income. To our knowledge, I've spoken at a few places where I've said that and no one's sort of jumped up and down to say, you missed me, but we haven't been able to find another major NGO or charity who's come out in support of a basic income yet. Our network is one of the largest charitable networks across Australia. We're made up of 34 agencies around the country that work with about 1 in 20 Australians. And all of our agencies are linked to the Anglican Church, providing caring and welfare services. So I was privileged last year to author a study for Anglicare Australia called Valuing Every Contribution, which surveyed support for alleviating poverty and raising incomes above the poverty line. And we also looked at how an unconditional basic income might change the way people would use their time and change their work patterns. In the months after that, another study that I authored was released called Asking Those Who Know, and that explored people's experiences of conditionality and the sort of coercion in the income support and employment service sector. So as Tim alluded to, we don't need to go over and over the evidence in the research, and I'm not going to do that, but I did want to flag both of those as pieces of research looking at both the income side and the conditionality side of basic income, which really inform our work and our perspective on this. But our work at Anglicare Australia on basic income really began back in 2018 with some research that we did that was not about basic income per se, but it was about Australian attitudes towards poverty and welfare. So we did some extensive and deep analysis of our own messaging. We looked at the broader sector's messaging on these issues to try and understand how it was landing and how persuasive we were being and how open people were to what we were saying. And at the end of that work, we decided that we needed to move towards an ask that was universal and transformative. And we also knew that we needed to move towards campaigning and advocating for that ask in a way that was driven by values and storytelling. That's how we landed on a basic income, and that's the work that I want to speak a bit about today. So when we look closely at the use of language, we learn a great deal about how the debate on welfare in Australia and overseas has evolved, and we also learn a lot about how narratives can change. So we looked at the history of welfare and welfare conditionality, as I said, not just in Australia but overseas, because we wanted to understand how people felt about the welfare state at times when it was being watered down. And we also wanted to learn a little bit about the language that the leaders of the day were using and that civil society was using. Conventional wisdom is that mutual obligations and welfare crackdowns, when they happen, they happen in response to public opinion. So that's what we thought. That's what many people think, with politicians getting tough on benefits because doing that is popular. But the research shows that that perception is actually false. A really good example of this, where we've been able to find some really good research, is in the UK. The welfare state was popular throughout the 80s and 90s, in spite of the fact that the Conservative government during that period was spending much of that time trying and failing to dismantle key aspects of the safety net. And those attacks on benefits were actually very unpopular. So research from the British survey of British study of social attitudes shows that attitudes didn't really harden until the late 90s. So what drove that change in attitudes? There's another explanation, and an analysis of parliamentary speeches found a clear pattern. So once the Labor Party under Tony Blair changed its rhetoric on welfare, that's when the public changed its mind. From the mid-90s and onwards, Labor spent much less time talking about the benefits of social security and much more time talking about problems with the system. And that was the critical factor that swayed public opinion. There's a lot of ways to interpret that research. In one interpretation, it suggests that Labor parties and other progressive actors are more influential in debates on income and welfare than their Conservative counterparts. But it also shows us that governments can't shape attitudes on their own without a political consensus. The consensus is critical. So it's the sum of the language that we use in the public domain and what's said on purpose and what we imply by omission. So in Australia, the really interesting thing is that civil society doesn't really see itself as part of that process. A lot of the advocates and organisations who we speak to kind of see themselves as passive actors who react to shifts in public opinion instead of shaping them, and they act within what they assume is an inevitable consensus on mutual obligation and scarcity. But there's actually very little evidence that the current consensus is popular with the public, and its existence really depends on the fact that it hasn't been challenged. The belief in that consensus really comes through in the sector's language. So as part of the language analysis that we did, we looked at how the welfare sector and anti-poverty advocates across Australia communicate with the public. And we found that we spend more time repeating opposing arguments instead of making our own. One of the parts of our network that we looked at was running a campaign called Job Seeker, Not a Dole Bludger. We also found just lots of statements in our reports, our media releases, our campaign work that sort of would say things like they would try to challenge the idea that people are lazy and don't want to work by just repeating those words. And examples like that really stem from the idea that the public already supports tough conditions for people in need of help. But it also stems from the idea that you need to repeat an opposing argument in order to challenge it, which is just at odds with just about all of the research on messaging and communications. When you accept an opposing position as a starting point and then repeat it, you're actually adding to a false consensus. And so we should be doing everything we can to avoid repeating messages about scarcity and conditionality. And so we really took that idea and tried to run with it. We're a big network and a big organisation, so obviously we have some difficulty implementing anything we decide to do, but that was the goal. We spoke to people a bit about how they want to be spoken about, and one of the things we found is that we speak about the people who we work with in ways that are really defensive and qualified. We focus on people who are sick or incapacitated or already in paid work, and those groups are often singled out with the emphasis that they really shouldn't be in poverty. But that just perpetuates existing narratives about conditionality and buys into the idea of a deserving poor by equivocating on the idea of who needs help. But the interesting thing is that doesn't seem to be needed. There's a lot of research that shows that equivocation doesn't work when you're communicating. But in that same piece of research, we did some message testing about who does and doesn't deserve to live in poverty. And the statement that attracted the most support, 86% agreement, was nobody deserves to live in poverty. So it attracted more support than propositions that people with disabilities, pensioners, people working full time. The statement that attracted the most support was actually the least qualified statement. So that might seem like a surprising result. I think a lot of us have been led to believe that a person's employment or disability status might make them more sympathetic, but we found that the clearest statements proved to be a lot more powerful. And it's a really strange contradiction that so many of us, including professional communicators and campaigners, are taught to qualify what we say to attract support. That's a real mistake. We shouldn't shy away from simply and clearly communicating our beliefs in unconditional support. But perhaps the biggest change that civil society needs to make is to see the political debate surrounding social security for what it is and joining it. A lot of the material that we looked at showed a real tendency to focus on evidence and research, speaking to politicians instead of building support in the public with values-led arguments. And that's been a losing strategy for decades. That's not to say that our work in the sector should be anything other than evidence-based, and it's not to say that the research isn't amply available. I've been online for most of today, and I've just been so excited and engaged to hear about all the things that everybody is doing, all the research that's out there. But, you know, on the flip side of that, you know, we know that there's no evidence that cashless welfare cards are helping people. We know that just, you know, work for the dole leaves people less employable than when we signed up. We know that the Aboriginal work for the dole scheme is just pointless and harmful to the communities who take part. And we know that employment services are doing very little besides creating an opportunity for private companies to make money. And a lot of that research is actually commissioned by and for the government itself. But while the government frames these debates in terms of discipline and responsibility and reciprocity, many advocates have eschewed those value-based narratives, engaging with those value-based narratives in favour of technical arguments that really erase the human experience. Tim touched on in his introduction the government's efforts to subject job seekers to drug tests, and they were really framed around social responsibility. They weren't about costs and saving money, but the welfare sector did respond by and large by highlighting the really exorbitant costs of the programs, which is quite puzzling. Charities like ours, Anglicare Australia, we exist to deliver a social good, and our responsibilities extend beyond service expertise to community, civic and moral spheres, and those public goods just can't be captured in the language of cost and logistics. And by avoiding the question of values, we abandon our area of natural strength. So I won't get into, I said I wouldn't get into the research too much, but I will just say the research that we have done shows that much of the public is already on side, and there's little to lose from telling a values-based story about what our welfare system could look like. The regime that we have of punishment and compliance can and should be replaced with a system that looks more like the one that people say they want, with less busy work and more support and real help for people who want it and incomes above the poverty line. Poverty is a structural crisis, not an individual one, and most Australians know it, and if they don't know it, they can know it because we can communicate with them about it. It's a really diabolical problem that so many of us have accepted a narrative that so few of us believe. So I'll just end by saying that I often end by saying that the public isn't a problem to solve. I think that's something that a lot of people in civil society believe. But research shows that the public are and can be allies. And so for us in civil society, the challenge is to develop a language that embraces and engages them and motivates them.
Thanks so much, Maiy. Excellent, striking research. Godfrey, over to you.
Thanks. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm zooming in from, the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. And what I'm talking about today really, I think, is the trade union, the relationship of the broader trade union movement to the universal basic income. And what I'd say is this. As far as sources of opposition to the UBI goes, within the Australian trade union movement at least, I would divide that opposition into two camps. One, a more paternalistic camp that has a suspicion or an outright hostility to the UBI on the basis that people might be less dependent on their jobs and therefore have less of a relationship of I guess, protection, paternalism towards their relevant trade union. That position, although not really that connected broadly in the real world, is around, and there are some large employers and some large unions where they feel like that's the issue. I don't think there's any point in time. I don't think there's any point wasting any deal of time with respect to that particular ground of opposition. The other one is rooted, I think, in more good faith on the basis of wanting workers to run the world, have a say, be treated with dignity at work. And that is a residual suspicion to what would be viewed as the tech bro view of the UBI, that by solving a matter of distribution, of a means of distribution, it's telling workers that we don't need to question the relative amounts of that distribution or what goes on within the realms of production. Now, whether or not that view holds any ground, I have a lot of sympathy to the comrades who hold that view, and I think largely it is a disagreement not on values, but a disagreement of analysis of the facts at hand. And that's why Tim's position, or the position that Tim has outlined in relation to reorganisation through collapse in the 4 stages, I think can hold a lot of merit in shifting large segments of the trade union movement, because largely if we're going to work around disaster organising, which is the multifaceted collapse of capitalism that we're going through, that is a thing that is thrown at us and we might as well use to build a better world, and looking to widen the scope of the commons. Those 2 works will either will I think provide ample ground for collaboration and provide a platform to build trade union support for the concept of a UBI. And I should just acknowledge that I have some conflict of interest here, in the sense that my wife is a poet, and there's probably no occupation that's going to stand to better from a UBI than the poet. But I think that there's real merit in the idea of what I would frame as disaster organising, which I think is fairly similar to the idea of reorganisation through collapse. And I base that on what I've seen play out in the real world. And my union, the United Workers Union, at the very early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, a UBI is not the official position of the United Workers Union, and I have met with senior leaders who would publicly say that they're sceptical at best in relation to the policy, or would hew to that second view around, is the UBI a tool to deflect from issues in relation to production through dealing with the question of distribution. Yet, through the crisis of COVID-19, the United Workers Union had a very early and clear public position that amounted to endorsing policies that were seemingly contradictory as a matter of theory, but made a lot of sense in the moment, by coming out and saying we need an equivalent of a universal basic income, we need a jobs guarantee, that every single worker counts, and that every single worker should be able to receive the economic subsistence that they need in order to contribute to the fight against this pandemic. That was a really interesting moment where we came out hard for essentially what ended up becoming Job Seeker and Job Keeper, with a very one critical difference, which was our union's position, was that it should all go to workers directly and not be mediated by a bunch of corporations, which I think played out there. So that was a real world case study, a real world example of the horizons that can open up in the moment of crisis, where a whole bunch of people in the trade union movement endorsed a UBI program, separate from how they might have felt about a policy discussion or an abstract discussion around whether or not a UBI is a useful policy. The moments of disaster, and whether that's through climate crises, directly fires, floods, economic crisis of capitalism, pandemics, all of these are connected. They will open up turf and terrain for us to be able to advocate for policies that are based on the concept of the UBI. The second area where we've had, I guess, a bit of a UBI like small scale experimentation, not local but small to a co-op, is the terrain of widening the commons, and at the same time, cooperative power at a union, ENGO, and cooperative-owned energy cooperative, it basically came out and for the income that it earned through the COVID-19 pandemic, said we're going to institute solidarity credits. We're giving up 100% of our income for 2020 and most of 2021. And that's going to go, and our customer members are going to just, without obligation, just be able to put up their hand and say they need help, and they're going to get it. And that was 50%, and 50% we're going to send for international solidarity in order to get through the social crisis of the pandemic. And our customer members in CoPower at the time enthusiastically voted for that policy, which is very, very minuscule in the scheme of things. This is a few hundred people trying to help each other in an act of radical mutual assistance, but ended up with a no obligation income payment to people. So the ability to engage in concrete struggles that deal with the disasters that workers face, and also proactively widening the commons, I think naturally lends space and deals with the best answer. The objection around, is this just deflecting relationships of inequality within the realm of production into distribution so that people won't question it? Well, that's a matter of power, and if we're building that power in order to dismantle power, then cooperating in a concrete sense around widening the commons and in the disasters that we face, open up that terrain, and then deal with the balance of power in order to deal with that objection. I think there's a lot of merit in that. So, that's it from me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Godfrey. That those solidarity credits from CoPower are just such a spectacular example of how this can work, I think. Handing over now to Abigail Boyd, MLC. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, and I will again acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands of the Turrbal peoples, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The ongoing climate and COVID crises have shown more clearly than ever that our current economic system is not fit for purpose. In response, our governments have bent what were previously assumed to be the rigid rules of running a capitalist society, abandoning the deficit myth, handing out billions in income support, and more people than ever before have begun to question our economic status quo. There has never, ever been a better time to push for a new way of doing things, to introduce new ideas, to fight for long overdue improvements to our economic system. But the fact is that no one's going to listen unless we embed those ideas within a compelling context. Tinkering around the edges isn't going to bring enough people with us. We need to paint a compelling picture of an alternative future, a future that is worth fighting for. Achieving a universal basic income will take nothing less than convincing the majority of the voting public that utopia is not only possible, but essential for our survival. And that's why in the midst of the first Sydney lockdown in 2020, my team and I spent weeks developing our own version of a universal basic income. We call it the Universal Wellbeing Payment. And as far as I'm aware, we are not only the first Australian political office to actively campaign for a universal basic income, but the first to put forward a concrete and detailed proposal for what an achievable, effective and transformative UBI could look like. Because if we're to achieve a universal basic income in this country, we need to be able to picture the difference it would make to our lives. Not a 2D picture, but a 3D picture with enough detail so that you can walk inside, take a look around and imagine what your life would look like if we were to implement a UBI. So our plan for a universal wellbeing payment is really, really very detailed. You can go to universalwellbeingpayment.com.au for full details, to sign up to the campaign and to leave feedback. But whatever you do, don't tell me that it's fanciful. You need to believe in utopia to have utopia. There will be those at the ready with their reasons why this proposal can't fit into the current economic status quo. but that is the whole point. Done right, a universal basic income is the foundation of a different type of economy, a modern economy that is fit for the 21st century, one that's designed to first and foremost provide for every person's basic needs, guaranteeing a minimum standard of well-being for all before anyone else gets to skim the surplus. The UWP starts with the basic premise that everyone in a country as rich as Australia has the right to a certain level of well-being, a right that is distinct from the right to engage in meaningful work. A universal wellbeing payment recognises that we all contribute in different ways. Whether you're a carer, an artist, a student, an entrepreneur, you can get on with what you need to do, knowing that you will be supported regardless of your income. Our ability to find paid work is not synonymous with our value as individuals. Our right to wellbeing is separate and distinct from our right to work. This is not a proposal that should be seen as in conflict with a proposal for a jobs guarantee. In fact, a jobs guarantee that sits on top of the universal wellbeing payment would cure some of the problems that a jobs guarantee might otherwise have. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into too much detail on that. But the language we use can, of course, either reinforce mainstream economic thinking or it can turn it on its head. And that's critical to why we called our version of a UBI a universal wellbeing payment. The universal wellbeing payment is universal in that everybody over the age of 16 would receive it. No conditions, no means testing, along with universal healthcare, universal education, and universal housing. The universal wellbeing payment would be a core part of our societal structure under a progressive economy. Yes, in many cases, the amount would be effectively taxed back when in the hands of the wealthy, and our website contains detail about how that calculation works. But by making it universal, the UWP ensures people's autonomy, which is so vital for mental health, while also ensuring that the stigma involved with being on so-called welfare is done away with. It is no one else's business whether you are reliant on the UWP at any particular time. No one should have to beg the government for the support they need in tough times. We shouldn't be forced to wait, to jump through hoops to meet conditions, or to repeatedly justify our circumstances to Centrelink. Imagine how much easier people would have found it during their pandemic if they already had universal wellbeing payments coming in, instead of having to wait to be noticed by the government as they fell through the gaps in our welfare system. And let me flag here our Greens initiative for a public bank that would facilitate those payments, which you can see at publicbankingnsw.com.au. There is nothing basic about the universal wellbeing payment. This is not an amount to ensure that you just survive. It is an amount to ensure that you thrive. It's not an amount that still forces you to take on paid work before you can do more than just get by from day to day. It's an amount that recognizes the contributions that we all make to our society, that recognizes the right of all of us to a minimum standard of well-being, regardless of whether or not we also have paid work. And the UWP is a payment. It's not income. It's not something you have to do something for. It's an amount you're owed simply for being a participant in our society, to spend however you like. And it's paid in addition to any support you currently receive for your additional needs or special circumstances, ensuring that people with a disability, parents, carers, and other groups will continue to receive more in recognition of their additional expenses. Importantly, the design of the UWP ensures that governments aren't let off the hook for providing essential public services like education, health, and public transport. The rate of payment will be independently reviewed and adjusted depending on cost of living pressures, taking into account, for example, the increasing cost of essential services in circumstances where governments are backing out of their obligations to provide them. Ideally, the universal wellbeing payment would be implemented nationwide, but it can be implemented at a state level with the cooperation of federal agencies. And that's important. If our federal government won't lift people out of poverty, our state and territory governments still have the responsibility and the means to do so. And when the stakes are so high, there should be nothing stopping us going our own way, building momentum for a UBI at local level and moving up levels of government from state to federal if that's what we need to do. We cannot tinker around the edges anymore, treading politely so as not to get criticised for being unrealistic, for failing to recognise the power imbalances that are preventing the many from wresting power off the few. The challenges we face are gigantic. Climate, inequality, health, and our economic system is standing in the way of us tackling them in any meaningful way. We cannot accept anything less than a complete overhaul of our economic status quo. Getting that will require us to inspire far more people to join us in our fight for change. So we must be unapologetic in demanding nothing less than utopia.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Abigail, for that really rousing and detailed closing to this panel. We've been very generously given an extra 5 minutes since there was a bit of difficulty changing over from before Greg's going to introduce Guy Standing for our the closing session. So Q&A with all of our panel members now. Questions, please. There's one up the back here. We've got a roving mic coming to you, sir, I believe.
Well, great talks, thank you. But I do have a question, I think it was for Godfrey on the union side. Why is it that the unions feel that the UBI can't be used as a strike fund in order to get better conditions, pay, shorter work week, more flexibility, and so on? It just seems to me surprising that that's not even a consideration, it would seem.
Partly I'd say that we can't separate the trade union movement from the broader crisis of capitalism that we're in, and the decimation of union density, the cracking down in terms of workers' rights, so that we're very highly regulated, has had its impact on the ability for unions to engage in considered policy-making process. Like the trade union activists, rank and file delegates, leaders like myself, we have had less time to engage in more far-sighted policy making, and that's probably not, that's probably intended, right? So I think that's genuinely part of it, and I think that with the other two elements, that there is a paternalistic thing of workers might be less dependent on this job, therefore we're less relevant. I subscribe to the school of thought that ideally someone like myself ends up becoming irrelevant because workers don't have issues. Unions still exist, but would be very different to what they are, rather than being irrelevant because we're marginalised by capital. But I think that the biggest good faith objection is around the idea that the UBI is substitute for workers collectively organising on the job, which most UBI activists I've spoken to don't hold that, but there is that element that people see in the media, and that's better dealt with through real-world collaboration with issues and problems that we face. And that's why I think the reorganisation through collapse as such a promising model of building support for the UBI.
Fantastic. Yeah, I would say there's no probably to that point at all. I think it's definitely deliberate. Elise.
Just a question for...
Yeah, why didn't you use this?
Thanks, everyone. A question for you, Abigail. I just wanted to know the relationship between your proposal and the Australian Greens proposal of the LIG, and how do they work together? Do they work together? What's the thinking around that? Thanks.
Just come up
here. I think they're quite different, unfortunately. So I have been lobbying at a New South Wales level to try and get that more fully fledged, bolder version of a UBI. I was really pleased to see in the latest federal election that the Australian Greens took forward, at least for certain categories of people, a real solid safety net, whether it was a job for job transition for coal workers or some sort of a livable income safety net. But yeah, I'm hoping that maybe the next federal election they'll have a fully blown federal UBI, but we'll see.
There's a question online about, in terms of the use of power, what are the thoughts on gaining support for modern monetary theory? And I'd be interested in other panelists' thoughts on this. One of my thoughts on MMT personally is that I am seeking, through all of my campaigning, including for UBI, to actually reduce the power of the state. And MMT fundamentally relies on state power. That's kind of its fundamental definition, I would have thought. And so that's one of my critiques of it, I guess. But yeah, I'd be interested in other people's thoughts on that question. Yeah, Abigail, do you want to go?
I just don't think that MMT takes us very far on the changes that we need to make. So yes, of course, we can produce money in that way. I think it's not so much a theory as a statement of how money is created. But when it comes to actually achieving the flattening of power imbalances that we have in society that have led to so many people being in poverty while other people can be billionaires, I don't think MMT has much to offer. And so, I always talk about we need to have a UBI because we cannot have an economic system where we have 13% of people in poverty. So it has to be step one. How we then work out where that money comes from and the other changes we make come separately. But what we can't do is just leave billionaires being billionaires. They need to be taxed in some way. And I don't think that MMT has an answer for that sort of rebalancing that we need to do in society.
Absolutely. Do any of our online folks have any comments on that you'd like to raise? No? Any questions? Sorry, Maiy, go.
I was going to say, we're interested in pure and Anglicare Australia, modern MMT, because it highlights the fact that governments make choices, and I think any tool that we have to highlight the fact that governments make choices, and poverty is one of those things that's a political choice, is something that moves the needle in a good direction. I was also going to say something about the previous question that was asked to Godfrey about unions. I think there's some obligation on us as well as communicators and campaigners to offer a vision of the basic income that's inclusive, that's, I think, because so many of the proponents of basic income are academics and journalists and people in creative industries, you can have a conversation about UBI that's often about creating a world where, we all get to create art and make our own cheese and do all these great things, but we need to also offer a vision that is going to include real people and that real people can see themselves in. And one of the really attractive things about a UBI is that it can completely reshape the relationship that working people have with their employers. If a person has access to an income above the poverty line that isn't connected to their job, work and working conditions will have to change. And that's a way that we can completely re-understand and reimagine people's power at work. So I think it's great to ask those questions of the union and the unions and the union movement, but I think there's also an onus that needs to be put on us to think about whether we're offering a vision of a UBI that's inclusive. That's not to say it shouldn't be utopian. I totally agree with that, but it does need to be a vision that people can see themselves in.
Wonderful way to end the panel. Blessed are the cheesemakers, I say, but yes, we need others as well. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Tjanara Goreng, Maiy, Azize, Godfrey, Moase, Abigail Boyd. Thank you.
So look, I know it's been a long day. We've got one more treat, really. Guy Standing's going to give a short overview of his book, very big book that is another one of Guy's books. This one's The Blue Commons, Rescuing the Economy of the Sea. Many of you would know Guy Standing from his contributions to thinking about work and labour, particularly on the precariat. He's a professorial research associate at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the College of London. He's also the co-founder of the Basic Income Earth Network, and he is usually here in person but unable to be this year because Guy had an operation that prevents him on the plane. He's okay, but he wasn't able to be here, but is still very keen to contribute, and he is one of the sponsors for this Congress this year as well. Guy doesn't know that he's the only thing standing between us and a drink. Good. That's one little dad joke for late in the afternoon. So he does know that he's only going to have 20 minutes, but we will hopefully have a few 5 or so minutes for questions. And I'll announce we've changed the location where we're going to have our welcome reception to an older part of the campus, which is part of the commons really actually on UQ. It's where the students, staff were encouraged to meet and to gather and talk together. So we're going to move to that location rather than be outside in the concrete part of the new campus. So without any further ado then, I think Guy is, there he is. Hey Guy, if anyone knows any time with Guy, you know that he loves the sea, not only from a sort of collective interest, but also from self-interest, because he spends a lot of time on the water or by the water fishing in it. So the health of the oceans is personally important to Guy as well. But I know he's going to talk more than just about the Blue Commons, also about common dividend. So over to you, Guy, and I'll let you know when you've hit 20 minutes. Okay, thanks.
Okay, can you hear me clearly, first of all? Can everybody hear me clearly?
Yes, we can all hear you, Guy.
Yeah.
Trust the technology.
Well, good. Thank you very much. I wish I were there, and it would be a great pleasure to be back. And I also enjoyed listening to the last session very greatly and agreed with Mai's final point. I've always advocated basic income as a matter of common justice, as a matter of increasing freedom, and as a matter of giving basic security to everybody, which is a human need. And in that context, I've been looking at how the debates around the commons relate to basic income. And what I've done in this book is tried to extend the arguments for a basic income into an area that has received remarkably little attention. Now, if you think of the sea of the world, then it covers 70% of the world's surface. 40% of the world's population live in communities connected to the sea. Half the oxygen we breathe comes from the sea. The sea contains over 3/4 of all life. And it is an economic zone that, if it was a country, would be the 7th largest in the world. And it's projected to double in the next decade in terms of about 6% of global GDP. So it's enormously important part of the global economy. And the big question is, who owns the sea? Well, you go back to the Justinian Codex of